Good morning, everyone. It is an early start for some of you and very early for myself. Welcome to this first COP27 Virtual Ocean Pavilion webinar, Whose Ocean Is It Anyway? I'd like to welcome first our panelists, who I'll be introducing during their presentations here. And thank you for joining us as viewers. We'll be having simultaneous translation in 6 languages during the course of this webinar today, the next hour and a half. First, I'd like to introduce the session and briefly outline the themes that we will be discussing. Whose ocean is it anyway? Why ocean heritage matters for climate change mitigation. The effects of a changing climate are disproportionately affecting coastal communities in the global south. Yet when climate mitigation plans are put in place, they typically follow Western frameworks, which often disregard the role of coastal and marine heritage and heritage practices in ocean resource use and sustainability. This event will present the essential role played by marine natural and cultural heritage for sustainable and effective climate action towards mitigation and adaptation strategies in the coastal and marine zone for the benefit of the people who depend on it. This panel is hosted by the Ocean Decade Heritage Network, which chairs the Cultural Heritage Framework Program and is an endorsed action of the UN Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development 2021 to 30, and the only action to date that addresses cultural heritage in the marine sphere. We are sponsored by the Honor Frost Foundation and Lloyd's Register Foundation. And this webinar is held in cooperation with University of Edinburgh and Edinburgh Marine Archaeology. Some of the themes we'll talk about today include natural and cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, coastal communities, climate change mitigation, marine cultural heritage, marine resource management, coastal and marine law and policy, and sustainable development. Just to work through our program today, we will have a variety of presentations from different panelists speaking about not only the ocean decade itself and catalyzing public support, but the effects of climate change on coastal heritage in different regions, particularly in East Africa. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Georgia Hawley from University of Edinburgh and also from the Cultural Heritage Framework Program. We'll be speaking about Rising from the Depths, Heritage and the Sustainable Ocean. She'll be followed by Professor Paul Lane, and we will also hear from Dr. Egidius Jumbaki, Ms. Chepkimbaki Labat, Dr. Jonathan Sharpman, Dr. Chris Underwood, and finally we'll have a panel discussion with questions moderated by Dr. Arturo Rey de Silva. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will hand over to Dr. Georgia Hawley.
So yes, thank you, Athena. And I also would like to extend my gratitude to the Virtual Ocean Pavilion for hosting us today as well. This morning, I'm just going to provide a very brief overview of why marine cultural heritage is not just important, but essential for the sustainable development of the ocean. In my talk, Rising from the Depths, Heritage and the Sustainable Ocean. Very briefly, the topics I'm going to discuss, I'm going to just look at what is marine cultural heritage, and its relevance within the ocean challenges, looking at its place in ocean management, and then I will exemplify these points with a case study of Rising from the Depths, and I'll talk about future legacies and hopes of the discipline in the future. So firstly, what we understand as marine cultural heritage is all past human interactions on the coast as well as directly on the sea, encompassing tangible remains such as shipwrecks, submerged settlements, coastal settlements, ports and harbours, maritime ecologies and geologies, as well as equally vital intangible components such as cultural practices, artistic and linguistic expressions, local skills, and traditional and historical knowledge. Now, you may notice that this is a broad definition of what constitutes marine cultural heritage. In fact, it's one of the broadest definitions that you'll find and includes both tangible, such as the shipwrecks, and intangible, such as cultural heritage and traditional knowledge, intangible cultural heritage, such as traditional knowledge. It includes all aspects of archaeology, including submerged settlements, ports and harbours, maritime landscapes and seascapes, and it stretches from prehistory to the modern day, connecting our past with our future. So ultimately, marine cultural heritage provides a testimony to how we, as a species, are connected with the water and each other. However, when we place marine cultural heritage on the global ocean stage, the importance of marine cultural heritage can sometimes be seen as a niche cause. We live in a world in which the impacts of overfishing, rising sea levels, warming oceans are reducing fish stocks and biodiversity and displacing millions of people. So considering these issues, the role of marine cultural heritage has often been overlooked. So hopefully today we'll be able to show why that shouldn't be the case. So there are multiple contributions of marine heritage as part of the greater ocean. The following points are really only a few examples, and a lot of the talks are going to go into more detail today about what these are. But the first 3 points really look at environment and environmental management. So a good example is when we look at shipwrecks and other submerged heritage, we see these environments provide refuge and habitat for a diverse range of flora and fauna. Often it can provide habitat for microbes to megafauna. And as such, these systems are beginning in some cases to be considered as ecological indicators for detecting changes in the marine environment. We also see that when communities are aware, there are studies that aware of their cultural heritage, both tangible and intangible. There are studies that show that people are more likely to adhere to protective management from both the natural and cultural environment. By studying sea level rise and the effect of climate change on communities in the past, we can provide historical context, particularly for the social impacts of climate change today, and provide base data for climate predictions in the future. And then the next 2 points talk about socioeconomics, and this is particularly important when we think about the information on the previous slide, particularly the 410 million climate refugees that we saw due to sea level rise alone. So when we look at how marine cultural heritage can contribute to these issues, we're looking mostly at ways in which we can enhance community resilience and adaptation, and how this can be enhanced within vulnerable communities. So there are various studies which show how community-led projects which celebrate and protect and share heritage can sustainably enhance revenue and gender equality and other such issues within communities themselves, including things like identity and sense of self and well-being and peace. And again, some of these projects will be discussed more as we go on. But first, it's important to note why marine cultural heritage experts are still arguing their relevance to aid in the global challenges such as climate change mitigation. So despite a swathe of information on the topic, marine cultural heritage until recently has largely been left out of most international marine resource management frameworks, including marine spatial planning and marine protected areas. We are now beginning to see more integration of cultural heritage within these systems, but as we do, the next challenge is that these resources are managed sustainably and ethically, which brings us to the title of this webinar today, which is Whose Ocean Is It Anyway? And in this, we can look at the fact that heritage is not for archaeologists or curators or the tourism board. Heritage is ultimately belonging to the people, to local communities, and built heritage or tangible heritage is intertwined with the often invisible or intangible heritage of these communities in the form of oral stories, traditions, and knowledge passed down through generations. So this brings us briefly on to our case study, the Rising from the Depths Network. So the project aimed to catalyze the utilization of marine cultural heritage for the benefit of coastal communities across the East African coastline. It funded 27 different projects in Kenya, Tanzania, Madagascar, and Mozambique. And I'm just going to talk about 2 of these projects today, which relate back to some of the benefits we were talking about earlier. And we also have a number of people who worked in this project here as well today. So firstly, the project using Fisher's traditional maritime knowledge. So this championed the use of traditional ecological knowledge and traditional heritage knowledge through translating it into local policy. So these types of knowledge systems will be discussed in greater detail later in this session, particularly by Shep. So I won't go into too much detail, but in basic terms, it describes the evolving knowledge of particular communities or community groups which have been passed down and is gained from direct contact with the environment or with heritage and heritage practices over generations. And this project particularly showed the necessity of bottom-up, community-led environmental management alongside the use of internationally standardized and agreed upon frameworks. And in this case, through the understanding and documentation and ethical inclusion of traditional knowledge within management, mitigation plans could be molded around traditional practices and ways of life that were specific to this region. And in doing so, it enhances the effectiveness of the plans themselves through the inclusion of essential knowledge and data, as well as the well-being of the local community, who now play an active role in the management methodologies of their environment. But ultimately, enhancing the stability of coastal communities in the face of coastal development and climate change was one of the central themes of this work. So one example of this output is the project Much Discovered in Meader Creek with the Bidinagazi Women's Group in Kenya. A key aspect of this project was developing and maintaining additional alternative livelihoods for women in Meader Creek, an area particularly affected by changing weather conditions, affecting community livelihoods and well-being. And as part of this project, the women's group developed a traditional restaurant, heritage-based ecotourism circuit, and ran it within the creek. And despite the impacts of COVID, which were huge for all of the projects within the network, the ecotourism circuit and restaurant still continues to make a profit for this group today, solidifying their place within the community and enhancing their resilience to the impacts of increasing temperatures and coastal erosion on the creek itself. So finally, I'll just briefly outline the future impacts and challenges from this point of view of what we've been talking about just in this presentation within environmental and climate management in the future. So firstly, despite the definition of marine cultural heritage that we're going to be talking about today, the discipline suffers from out-of-date, typically monumentalist views of heritage in some cases, which limit the protection of what we understand to be heritage today, which is a diverse mix of tangible, intangible, past and present histories, practices, archaeology, and livelihoods. So value-led definitions need to be integrated into management, which take into account not economic value, but socioeconomic and environmental benefits to diverse groups within communities. And then furthermore, of course, we always need more inventories, identification, documentation of marine cultural heritage, as we simply don't have enough data. But ultimately, change happens in the form of informed and updated policy and legislation. So it's clear that in many cases, the use of traditional regulatory systems are often more effective than national policy. And this is largely due to the integration and management of resources by the community themselves, who often have the most in-depth and accurate knowledge of the environment and heritage. So protocols such as this deserve recognition and legitimization. And as part of this, the protection and management of natural and cultural heritage cannot be considered as separate entities. So people and the environment have always been and will always be intertwined. And eliminating the vast cultural heritage, which has both molded and been molded by the natural environment from management, ultimately eliminates the people who depend on it the most. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Georgia, for your presentation. And thank you also for keeping to the time. That's a very nice introduction to where we'll be departing with Professor Pauline's talk, Integrating Deep Histories of Maritime Socio-Ecological Practices into Planning for Sustainable Resilient Futures. Paul.
Thank you, Athena, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I don't have a presentation to show you, so I'm just going to talk. And I should just introduce myself as that I am an archaeologist. So I'm going to talk about all of those tangible things that Georgia sort of said we need to park to one side and make sure that we consider the intangible heritage as well, and how the tangible and intangible are intertwined. COP27 and all the previous COPs have been intended to ask us all individually and collectively how we respond to the current climate crisis. It is a climate crisis. It is not an impending one. It is here, it is now, it is affecting all of us in a variety of different ways. And as Georgia highlighted, many of the communities in the global south are differentially impacted by the current climate crisis compared with those of us who live in the global north. Yet, again, I think there's consensus that the economies of the global north have been largely responsible for the acceleration of climate change over the 20th century. As Georgia highlighted as well, whilst there are it's important to think about how societies and economies move forward into the future. And as a consequence, the past and how we got here often gets overlooked. And I think this is particularly true of archaeological records of how coastal communities in the past responded to the opportunities and constraints of living in coastal contexts, and also responded to previous phases of dramatic climatic change. So I'm going to highlight, if you like, 3 areas where I think archaeological data has something to contribute to how we plan for sustainable living. I'd rather we use a concept of sustainable living rather than sustainable development, because development in some respects continues to emphasize growth and economic growth, and that may not be really where our future lies. It may be that we need to live, construct a way in which we live sustainably, but without necessarily emphasizing that huge expansion of industry and related technologies. One way in which archaeological data really has an important role to play is that it provides the greatest temporal depth, the greatest record of how people have utilized coastal resources in the past. Now, when it comes to, for example, establishing marine parks and conservation areas, marine ecologists, marine biologists will rely most heavily, and rightly so, on observational records of the marine ecologies in the recent past. In the best case scenarios, those observational records perhaps span 250 years. And they will take those records of perhaps the ecologies before massive expansion of global economies in the 20th century as the starting point. This is the baseline for which the kind of ecology, marine ecology, that they aspire to either reconstruct or conserve in their marine designated protection areas. Yet, we know from archaeological sources, from the faunal records, from the bioarchaeological records, and other data that are recovered from coastal sites, that those marine ecologies that are captured, 250 years ago when the first observations are being made, are not necessarily an ideal record for using as a baseline. And we can use archaeological records of previous fish compositions, other coastal ecologies, distribution of mangroves, other coastal habitats, etc., to identify possible other baseline states that we might want to aim for. The second area I think that archaeological data has something to contribute is if we think about the whole issue of sustainability. So for something to be sustainable, it needs to last over time. At least it needs to endure, and it needs to endure in a particular way without doing environmental and ecological harm. The only record that we have of what practices are indeed sustainable and how long they're sustainable for is in the past. We can model and project that certain practices may well be more sustainable than current ways of doing things, for example, low carbon or no carbon energy systems. But at the local level, which is where things really impact on human communities, it is in the archaeological and historical records that we can trace how different, whether or not certain kinds of practices, certain ways of engaging with marine resources caused harm, were transformative in terms of their effects on the local marine ecologies, or whether they were indeed sustainable within the terms of the Brundtland definition. And I think this then comes to my third and final point, about, which is really where we interweave, if you like, the tangible with the intangible. That it is, whilst global measures and interventions are absolutely essential, it is at the local level that these interventions have consequences. This is where those actions either generate positive effects and positive ways of living, or whether they result in dislocation, disjunctures between society and environments. And in the longer term also, I think that we need to use the coastal and maritime heritage of the places and ideals of where people live to provide them, if you like, with, or to reinforce their sense of ontological security in being in the world and in being in those areas. And as I think Georgia's talk highlighted, and I know Ichus will reiterate, it is that heritage and that sense of place, of sense of belonging that comes from knowing about and caring for that heritage and seeing it protected, that provides people with a sense of being and sense of place, and that in turn creates a hope for the future. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your intervention. Thank you for bringing up those three really key points. And I really like the phrase sustainable living. I think that's a very important thing to highlight, because development, certainly in many cases that we'll see today, is an issue for this heritage, and what can we accept and not accept in terms of forgoing our own heritage. Our next speaker is Dr. Elgidius Ichumbaki. He will be speaking about coastal heritage and climate change along the East African coast, past, present, and future.
Thank you very much, Athena, and thank you everyone for joining. I also thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I will try to go through a discussion on coastal heritage and climate change, and I will use the East African coast as a case study to try to see the past, where we are now and where we want to go probably in the future. I think where Paul ended makes us try to discuss and see what kind of evidence we can look into, and probably confirm that when we talk about climate change, it's something that is real and is not really in different areas, but our own cultural heritage, in particular marine cultural heritage, are impacted greatly. And I will focus on the Swahili coast. This is 3,000 kilometers along the coast of East Africa, from Mogadishu in Somalia all the way to Mozambique. And this is the area that has been in interaction with different parts of the world, particularly the Indian Ocean, for millennia. And this interaction left multiple evidences, what we call stone towns. And these stone towns were built very close to the sea, just a few meters to the sea. And because of the rising sea level, many of these cities are being eroded, making as roots important evidence, important legacies, which we could use to understand our past, but also project our future. I'll try to highlight a few examples here from two sites, in Kirwa and Bagamoyo, and see how the rising sea level is indeed affecting and eroding not only monuments and sites, but critical archaeological artifacts such as beads, ceramics, and other important ones. So for instance, this is a 17th century palace in Kirwa Kisiwani, which is a critical legacy when it comes to the links between Tanzania, or the mainland part of Tanzania, and Zanzibar, because this was the center of administration during the 17th century. And a large vessels, many vessels were anchoring on this particular area where we find multiple evidences. But because of the rising sea level, we have plenty of artifacts being eroded at that particular site. The same applies to the 14th century Paris in the same area of Kirwa, where we have plenty of artifacts on the shore being eroded because of the rising sea level. This is probably the most evident example of how materials that could tell us about the past interactions between locals and other people from across the world were engaging. You could see a lot of not only the building in here, but the materials, the artifacts that you could record and inform about the past from along this particular area have all been eroded due to rising sea level, mostly caused by climate change. Again, this is a 16th, 17th century mosque in Songomnara, which has also been significantly eroded, and it's within the middle of the mangrove. So it doesn't make any sense to say this mosque was built right there on the ocean when it was being built, but it's because of the rising sea level which has eroded a significant part of the area and leaving this mosque into the middle of the mangrove. Further evidence include this 18th, 19th century complex, which was part of the slave activities north of Bagamoyo, and is almost completely gone because of rising sea level, and you can see a lot of things. So when you go closer to the site, there are walls and artifacts that would help us to further describe these particular buildings. They are all being eroded, and it is the impact of rising sea level which causes all this. Probably I should give this example, which I have experienced myself. This is a 16th tomb, again in north of Bagamoyo. And the first time I visited it in 2017, it was about 50 meters away from the shore. But 2 years later, there has a significant increase of sea level, and almost half of it were significantly eroded by the rising sea level in 2019. And in 2021, this is what we see in there. Now, the question is how much of similar legacies we have lost because of the rising sea level? How much artifacts we have lost because of climate impacts, including the rising sea level? So there are quite a lot of issues that we need to look into and try to come up with some strategies that would help not only with these significant historic remains, but also recent one. This one, for instance, is in Bagamoyo, on the custom house, and there is almost a daily increase of sea level, which destroys even recent investment and construction. So to put just it much very easy is that it's not only the history, but also the lives of coastal communities like this village in here being forced to shift their environment, I mean their habitation, to shift their settlements because of the rising sea level and other climate impacts. So this village here is an example of how the settlements along the coast of East Africa are being impacted, and they are being eroded because of that rising sea level. Now, generally speaking, there are several evidence which indicates rising sea level, probably due to climate change, and the coastal area is very risky. There is quite a lot of monuments and historic buildings which are being affected by the rising sea level. So artifacts like ceramics, beads, and coins, which we find on the shore, they are being eroded and therefore losing important history that we need to understand and use to reconstruct our past lifeways. So the coastal communities can no longer accumulate and make their living as they used it to do because of those changes, and there is something that we need to do. But despite all these examples I have provided, there are no strategic formulations, particularly in East Africa, which indicates a strategic intervention to make sure that these coastal erosions, which impacts archaeological heritage, are being addressed accordingly. And the local people are not very well educated on what kind of strategies they could do to make sure that we intervene into these changes and make the necessary intervention. So I'll try to give some of the interventions that we have tried and engaging communities, but one of them has been to let the local people themselves see the changes and use smartphone to document some of these sites. So we have created a mobile application which gives the volunteers on the ground on daily basis try to record the type of artifacts they see as they are being eroded and the changes that they notice. So as I'm seeing here, an example, the local people themselves, a number of students we have trained, they are trying their best to record and document some of the changes, take pictures and save these into a database for further view and people can have a look. But we have also done some exhibitions to bring awareness, to raise awareness to the people, and many stakeholders try to see to what extent these changes affect the coastal heritage and what kind of initiatives that could be done. So as you will see on the right-hand side here, we have a number of comments from the local people, and some of the people who visited the exhibitions try to give the ideas what kind of strategies we could do. But bottom in the middle, we have a number of locals working together, at least to collect some of the plastic materials and the bottles that in one way or another are dated to the beach and destroy marine environments. And on the left bottom, we have a number of students and tourists visiting the exhibition and try to engage one another on how we could go. But as part of the initiative to make sure that we deliver the message, we have created a song in the local music kind of idea, try to make sure that at least the young people and the colleagues who cannot access our reports and our academic publications, they can get an idea of what this coastal heritage is and how the erosion affects the heritage that we are talking about. So we have this song which is called Climate and Heritage, and it's available for free if somebody wants to get a look on the kind of ideas and the kind of message we are presenting into that song can be viewed in that particular song and in that particular link. So I thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to receive questions and comments from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Egidius. That's very helpful to see some of the solutions that you've come up with, particularly the citizen science app. I really like that intervention for looking at particularly the built heritage. Moving on, we're going to, where our speakers are all doing very well on their time. Moving on, we'll next have Ms. Chepkemboy Lavat. She'll be speaking about tech.
So I want to welcome you to this morning or this evening, depending on where you're coming from. My name is Chep, and I want to talk to you about tech. So traditional ecological knowledge or local knowledge is knowledge that is found among indigenous communities or local communities who share a common history. And it's a collection of knowledge that has been passed on from generation to generation about the way they use the natural environment. In the Swahili coast, you need to understand some of the spiritual terms that are found on the landscape. So for example, you need to understand that mashetani is a type of spirit that usually is found on land, and it's usually able to shapeshift itself. And then mapepo is a type of spirit that is able to possess you. It can also possess animals, and that's why you have a lot of livestock among the communities. Then you have majini. It's a Swahili word to just mean water. So these are spirits that are just found within the water environment, and they're everywhere. And then there is something known as mzimu, which is a sacred space. And they're usually associated with islands, very large trees or baobab trees, and also coastal forests and terrestrial forests. My study area was Kenya and also Pemba Island in Zanzibar. The communities, they share a lot of demographic commonalities in terms of low educational levels, low levels of motorization within their vessels. But I had 3 island communities, Funzi, Tumbe, and Dagoni, and one community that was chosen because of the conflict that is present in terms of fisheries. They have a lot of resident and non-resident migrant fishers who practice ring net fishing, and this is bringing a lot of conflict with traditional fishers. Then we have Funzi. It's also exhibiting a lot of land use changes, and this one is having problems in terms of the number of canoes that are available because there are no more big trees that they're able to construct canoes from. So you find that it's very few canoes are available. Then we have Tumbe. Tumbe it's found in Pemba Island, and it has a very strong traditional fishing practice. They have a lot of canoes, and also they have the new sort of fishing practices with nets. But something that has taken place is that within the 1990s, you have the introduction of seaweed farming, and this one is affecting, it is important, but at the same time, it is something new within the environment. And this is affecting the seagrass ecosystems because they cannot coexist. So where they are planting the seaweeds, there used to be seagrass beds. And then finally, we have Dagoni. Dagoni by its name just means a place that actually used to not be inhabited by people, but fishermen. The migrant fishers used to go there for dago or ago, which means they are coming there to fish on a seasonal basis. But because of all the pressures in terms of human population growth, people are leaving areas to be able to find virgin grounds to be able to fish. And something that is also key here is that there's a lot of women who use the intertidal area to glean. And women are usually left out in a lot of studies on fisheries. So you need to understand that there's a diversity of genetic resources that communities depend on for their livelihoods. And these genetic resources are what decide the sort of knowledge that is being shared and passed down from generation to generation. So because of these threats, we have, for example, you have the lobsters, which culturally were not exploited, but because of the economic value that they have right now, you have the expansion of the food web and expansion of the target species that communities are using. They also use baits. You have now the fishing down, whereby they're going towards smaller species to be able to feed and to be able to provide for their communities. With the reeds and basket trap fisheries, there's at least no problem so far. But now with the women, there's so much pressure because they have been left to just stay in the intertidal area. So they're expanding on the macroinvertebrate species that they exploit, such now that they're having like ecotoxicological problems because now there is sewage that is entering the system, and then it's being bioaccumulating up the food web, and the women are forced to eat because they have no alternative. So like I said, they are losing raw materials to make their canoes. And also the mzimus are being lost. And because for coastal development, for settlements, but again, seaweed farming. So something that is noted is that this is a species of baby shrimp known as duvi. And I observed that there was a local extinction event taking place, whereby this is found within an estuarine and a brackish system. So in the upstream communities are able to exploit it at a very high rate, such that right now, the downstream communities of Dagoni and also Vanga, they're not able to have this. And this is affecting the women's livelihoods. And because it's not being observed in terms of, it's not considered a commercial species, we're missing out on loss of biodiversity. globally. So you have local extinctions, and then you also have global extinctions. So some species of rays and sharks, which right now a third of them have gone extinct because of the human pressure. And they're very important because they are being eaten for lactating purposes. And this one is interfering with maternal health and food security. So there are certain species also that they do not eat. We also have the loss of ceremonies and rituals that used to take place when they were switching from a fishing season, which is the northeast monsoon, into farming season, which is the southeast monsoon. And traps and fences are now disappearing because the sort of ceremonies that they used to practice so that they could have a good fishery that year is no longer being practiced because of the conflict with religion, because it's considered idol worship. But also within the fences, you have the marine tenor system, which is very unique. It's whereby a fence is actually passed on from generation to generation. But because of the fishing pressure from the large artisanal fleets, you're having less fish going to the shallow areas. That means the younger generation prefers to go into the net fishing, and therefore the traditional practices are actually dying down. And when they die with it, they also carry with them the information. So the ceremonies are also linked to certain species. The greatest pressure in terms of fisheries is you're finding like sand is being used as a sinker for the nets. So they're using sand is coming from the beach, sand that is from the sandbanks and the barrier sands, and this is making increasing the sea level rise. So you find like in such an area where they used to have lower sea levels, now it's having very high sea levels, and that means you have saltwater intrusion. That means that now the groundwater is having high salinity, and that means the agricultural practices are under threat. So it means you're creating food insecurity because they're not able to plant their crops. You're creating water insecurity because of the intrusion of the salt, and also you're displacing communities and also losing the memories that are linked to those communities. So this is an example of how we were able to use tracking devices to be able to track how fishermen use the space. And if you look at this picture, you just see point sources of all the different grounds. But then you also have on this side tracks. So you're able to see this is an area where there's an MPA. You can see that they travel through the MPAs. There's also transboundary activities taking place. And if you are not able to do that, you won't be able to combine the culture with the fishing practice to be able to come up with better designed policy, which is important for navigation and for safety at sea. So what we can see is that tech is linked to the history of sustainable development. It helps you to identify local extinctions and biodiversity. It shows you that there's some subsistent practices that are under threat and need to be safeguarded against commercial expansion. And these are cultural indicators that can indicate sea level rise and are good for transboundary legislation, and also it promotes cultural sensitivity. So tech is extremely valuable to the world heritage of mankind. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chep, for that really impressive presentation on traditional ecological knowledge, and especially with the looking at the coastal fisheries, how they're being affected, and that knowledge that goes with them. Our next speaker is Dr. Jonathan Scharfman, who will be speaking about decoding local maritime cosmologies to identify historical approaches to mitigating environmental challenges.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers and to everybody who's attending. I want to talk a little bit about some of the studies we've done on how people have approached and adapted to and mitigated for climate change, and what we can learn from people's adaptations in the past, and what this means from a heritage perspective, and the role of heritage in the decade of ocean science. We have been listening to presentations that have been very broad about archaeology, about community engagement, about looking at how to involve local communities in adapting to climate change and managing the impacts of climate change. And I wanted to briefly look at what it is that we can learn from these. What do we learn from the past? And particularly, what do we learn through the disciplines of archaeology, history, anthropology, that look at the way people have managed and adapted to climate change in the deep past. I wanted to take that approach because I think that these disciplines are critical in the decade of ocean science. I think we tend to look at ocean science very much from the perspective of the hard sciences, and it's quite a difficult sell to understand how heritage plays a role in that. But I do think that it's critical, and hopefully through these case studies we can understand that a bit better. In thinking about archaeology and thinking about what it is that we do learn from the material culture that we get from the past, and very often we look at that in the context of people's use of available resources, trade, migration, people's expansion through ocean travel and ocean connections. And we're able to track social changes through the archaeological record and through the historical and anthropological record as well. But what does that really tell us? Very often, what comes out of these studies, I think, is that people's methodology or the way that people adapted to climate change in the past was simply to move into new areas where resources were more abundant, where land was more arable, and where people could live more happily. But that's not the reality that we face today. I think people's movement is very much restricted. Every time we open a newspaper or turn on the news, we see how people trying to migrate away from difficult circumstances are blocked. So we need to maybe look at different approaches to environmental change and to climate change than just that idea of, well, it's no longer any good here, we will move to another place and use the resources that are available there. I think we also need to look at people's approaches to climate change from a more global perspective. As we become a much more globalized society, those adaptations that were applied locally or that affected us locally no longer apply. We have to think about that in the much broader context. What affects us on a local level really becomes a global issue later on. How do we approach these phenomena? Although they may manifest themselves locally, what are the broader impacts and what do we do about that? I wanted to look at very briefly at three case studies. Some fish traps, they're all South African case studies, by the way. Some fish traps right at the southern tip of Africa, some adaptations and resource use on the wild coast of South Africa, a little further to the north. And then I realized that this is straying a little bit away from ocean science, but I wanted to incorporate marine impacts more broadly to look at a case study at a place called Lake Fundutsi, which is right in the northern part of South Africa and in the interior. And I want to get to that first. We often think about climate change and the impact of climate change in terms of sea level rise, but there are other marine issues and marine resources that are impacted equally in the interior. So the case of Lake Fundutsi, the challenge here is not sea level rise or water level rise, it's the fact that the lakes are emptying out, that the resources are becoming more scarce because of drought and various other local environmental impacts, which are manifested through, or not manifested through, but that are caused by a much broader globalized climate issue. So to give you a brief background on Lake Fundutsi, there are 7 villages around this lake, and the resource, as I said, is a shrinking resource. The fish are becoming more and more scarce. Access to the lake is becoming more and more difficult. The way that this has been managed is that one of those villages has an ancestral connection to the lake. One of these villages has an intangible heritage that is associated with this lake, and they have become the custodians. Through this, they manage what happens on that lake. They manage access, they manage what it is that people are allowed to do, the number of fish people are allowed to catch, and various other things that go around that, irrigation and various other aspects. This is a cultural approach to heritage management and to resource management and environmental management, which, although not unique to this area, is something that is important in how people approach this. I'll get to some conclusions in a bit. I just want to go through the background of all of these case studies very briefly first. The second one I wanted to look at is stone-walled fish traps. These are on the coast. And for those of you who haven't seen stone-walled fish traps before, they are piles of stones which form arcs that go out into the ocean. The way that they work is when the tide is high, they're covered and fish swim into the traps. As the tide goes out again, fish are trapped behind these walls and they become easier to catch. These are potentially around about 2,000 years old. The challenge here is that as sea level changes, they become less effective. And as fish stocks diminish, the way that people access these and access the resources within these fish traps has to change. The way that this has been managed has been from a national level. There is environmental and heritage legislation that determines how people access the fish traps themselves and what people are allowed to harvest from those fish traps, the kinds of fish that should be caught there. And there are some challenges associated with that because it's obviously not a selective process. Whatever comes into the fish trap is trapped. But how people are allowed to access those fish and what they're allowed to do with them has become a national issue and is very much governed by that national legislation, which has led to some conflict between the local communities who are using them and the heritage and environmental managers who work at a national level and control what happens there. The final case study that I wanted to look at is the case study on the wild coast of South Africa. And here, the way that people manage the resources has become a combination of natural and cultural resource management. And the way that manifests is through a set of social norms that determine how people access the sea and what they do with those resources. This case study relied very much on intangible heritage and the collection of the narratives around how people viewed the sea and access to the sea. What was interesting here is that this was a very dynamic system of managing resources and accessing resources, because as the environment changed, so the narrative changed, so that intangible heritage changed. To give an example, a set of taboos is coded into that cultural milieu, into the way that people adapt and live in those societies. Things like the kinds of fish that are available to catch, what is considered acceptable and what is considered unacceptable. And this changes the way that people look at the sea, because it changes the way that they access those resources. And as I said, it's a dynamic approach to cultural and natural heritage management. These three approaches are quite different. Lake Fundutsi is hardwired into the political system. There's the village and the royal family of that village who control access and manage the way that the lake is used and the resources are used. The fish traps, as I said, are governed by this national legislation, which leads to some challenges. The wild coast, on the other hand, is this evolving social system. As the environment changes, those social systems change and those cosmologies change. And that, I think, is a very interesting approach. What this does is it shifts the power of resource management away from those political systems, away from those legislative systems, and puts it into the hands of the people who live at the coast. It puts it into the hands of the people who understand how that environment is changing and what is not acceptable in terms of resource use and resource access. It also changes the way that we as heritage managers and as environmental managers look at the resources and look at adaptations to climate change. And I think this is where we can learn from heritage and from the past. Instead of us saying, these are the problems, these are the traditional solutions, it asks the people living at the coast, what do you want us to know about the way that you adapt to those climate changes? What do you want us to know about how you adapt to those local environmental changes? And I think this is important. And the case of Lake Fundutsi versus those sites on the coast illustrates this quite well, because climate change is not a one-size-fits-all. Global climate change manifests in those local contexts. The way that the local environments and weather patterns change is important for us to understand, whether it's drought at Lake Fundutsi or sea level change along the coast. And the way that people have adapted to those local challenges, I think, is important in us understanding how we can apply legislation, how we can apply management strategies to adapt to that as well. What this does for us is allows us to look at that heritage from a perspective of what becomes relevant, and how do we adapt that? How do we code that into the way that we use the oceans, and how does that become sustainable? I very much liked Professor Lane's concept of sustainable living, because I think that speaks to this quite clearly, that this is not just something that we apply globally. It's not about development. It's about people surviving and adapting to local change. Where I think that this is important is that it's taking these very localized systems, these very localized codes of environmental management and adaptation, and applying them on a global level. And I think we've been making this move from these global solutions to a very localized inspection of how people work. And this brings it back out again. This kind of completes the circle. I said right at the beginning that I believe heritage is critical in the decade of ocean science. And the reason that I think that, and this has come out quite strongly through the presentations, is that approaches to heritage, the study of heritage as a discipline, as a field, incorporating all of the disciplines of archaeology, history, anthropology, and all of those other areas that are seen as the soft sciences, they really are multidisciplinary, far more so than those hard sciences. When we do archaeology, we look beyond just the material culture. We incorporate the historical narratives, we incorporate heritage, we incorporate the anthropology, but we also use the techniques that are seen in the sciences to understand what it is that we're trying to understand, and to decode what is happening on those ancient and historically relevant sites. I think we have access to a very, very deep archive of knowledge about how people used and adapted to climate change and used the resources. And I think this is especially relevant to the way that we approach sciences now. That this is not a one-size-fits-all, that we understand that these are approaches that are implementable locally, and that we can learn the lessons from what we're seeing locally. I think I will leave it there. I hope I've stuck within the time limit. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I think that's a really important point to bring up again, your citation or of what do you want us to know of how these narratives fit into our broader perspectives of understanding also ecosystems, but also changes and policy management. Our last speaker today is Dr. Chris Underwood. We're speaking about the Ocean Decade, catalyzing public support and engagement.
Hello, Athena. Thank you very much for that introduction. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
What I do need to do is go back to the beginning. It's a rather bad way to start. Okay. Well, morning, good evening, and good afternoon, wherever everybody's listening from. It's a pleasure to be part of this seminar. And thanks to Athena and the various sponsors for allowing me to have a few minutes of your time. I'm also extremely grateful to my previous colleagues and speakers who've presented us with a range of very relevant and interesting and broad scope of how cultural heritage can contribute to mitigating climate change. In my presentation this morning, I'd like to introduce you and in fact take you back to the beginning of this process, back to 2019, but also say how critically important the engagement and involvement of the public is to the success of the Ocean Decade. These are my personal reflections from the first planning meeting of the Decade of Ocean Science. And they were quite stunning in the sense that you can see the top one, which I've highlighted most boldly, is the ocean is not too big to fail. And of course, from our perspective, that is the big picture. It was also evident that, as we all already know, that sometimes, quite often in fact, our underwater cultural heritage is referred to as out of sight, out of mind. And our colleagues in the other marine sciences present at that meeting also referred to themselves being out of sight, out of mind. When in fact, in a sense, from my perspective, you look at the ocean, it's in sight, but out of sight and perhaps taken for granted. The important things that my takeaways were open access and data sharing, citizen science and ocean literacy. And of course, we were very fortunate to have the input from members of the Ocean Decade to creating Societal Outcome 7, which basically refers to the inspiring and engaging ocean. And of course, from past experience when dealing with the public, sometimes the ocean can be seen as something that's quite intimidating. And of course, from our particular perspective, shipwrecks do not exactly represent positive activity related to the ocean. So our big task is bringing the underwater cultural heritage and making it inspiring and engaging within the concept of the ocean. And again, one of my takeaways from that very first meeting is in the quote at the top of the page, is that without the support of the public, the Ocean Decade will not be successful. And I've taken that to heart, and of course, my experience with working with recreational divers predominantly really understood from that moment the importance of bringing our sciences, our knowledge, our information from the past to the public and making accessible and making an impact on the success of the decade. Many of you, and I'm very grateful for Jonathan giving an outline of a case study very relevant to this, but I'm also grateful for Akifumi and the team for doing his tidal weir project mainly in Asia, but elsewhere as well, which identified many aspects, not just of the Decade of Ocean Science and climatic change, but also other SDGs within the 2030 agenda. And I've highlighted those things that I think are very important within Akifumi's project. The loss of the fishing, as again, Jonathan explained, very articulated, is that it improved the health of the local population. It decreased child morbidity and improved cognitive performance and strengthened the immune system. All that around the planet is at risk. Acidification and plastic reduces the production of biodiversity. And again, that's a threat to food security. And we must move to a harmonious interaction between humanity and ecosystems. And I think, having been privileged to be part of the co-sponsored meetings run by IPCC, UNESCO and ICOMOS, it became very clear that local indigenous knowledge combined with, let's say, traditional sciences were a very, very core component of our work moving forward. There's also the emergence of biocultural heritage. And this is actually an example of underwater cultural heritage, which is located in the north of Canada, where it was imperative and a legal imperative to be involved with the local Inuit peoples, who provided their traditional knowledge, which aided in the discovery of those two shipwrecks, Erebus and Terror. And of course, part of this is the essential components of well-being. And you can see the bottom quote there is interlinkage of biological and cultural diversity of indigenous people and local communities from seeds to landscapes and from knowledge to spiritual values handed down from generation to generation, all combined to link with the discovery of those 19th century shipwrecks. It was a very good example. The Decade of Ocean Science Societal Outcome 7, again, is basically about understanding the economic, social, and cultural values of the ocean and the plurality of roles that it plays to underpin health, well-being, and sustainable development. I've listed a number of underwater or heritage-related outlets, stakeholders, who can play a significant role in bringing this message to the general public. The recreational diving communities. There are national and international organizations such as the World Heritage Diving Organization, which has locations in more than 100 countries. There are others, the Professional Association of Diving Instructors, the same. They have multi-representation in many, many places around the globe. Maritime museums, the International Congress of Maritime Museums, play a crucial role in bringing cultural heritage to the public. And we know that there are some very fine examples of where shipwrecks have been recovered and are presented to the public. Some way has to be found and encourage these maritime museums to present our message of creating a more inspired and engagement with the public related to climate change. The UNESCO accredited NGOs, I'm fortunate enough to chair this organization, and within it, there are many of them have significant programs that can be used to bring our message to the public through the recreational diving community, but also beyond. I was also struck by the need to create data, and I think previous speakers have provided ample examples of where data can be of extreme use to the combating climate change around the world, and particularly in those local communities that suffer such great impact. So open access data sharing, of course, that's got to be accessible, opens the door to citizen science, which again, I'm very grateful for my previous speakers for mentioning this already, and the role of citizen science in acting as the eyes, ears, and let's say recorders of, as we know, increasing numbers of cultural heritage sites on the coast and near shore being badly affected by the impacts of climate change, particularly sea level rise, but also extreme weather events. All that can be combined. And I see a major component, our partnership with the media, social media, and the traditional media have a huge role to play in getting our message across to the public and other stakeholders. Just an example of mitigation and citizen science. This is a European project which is aimed at cleaning the ocean, but this can be extended to monitoring through adopt-a-ret schemes as used by my colleague Andy Viduka in the South, the Global South. But there are objectives within the Decade of Ocean Science that open that door, including Objective 1, the increased transformative ocean knowledge, capacity globally, capability globally. Those that open the door to building on, and again on the right-hand side, that's multi-beam, which may be beyond the sort of expertise of recreational divers, but there's no reason why those can't be managed and monitored and seen by recreational diving community working hand in glove with the professional heritage managers around the globe. And finally, just to summarize, inspiring, engaging, and you see the image on the left, this is the Humanity at Sea, Esbjerg, Denmark, looking outward. And it's, I think, been my observation over the last 2 years as the decade has unfolded that humanity tends to look inward, and for obvious reasons, looking at mitigation and solutions to terrestrial issues and impacts. Whereas I think some space, some finance should be made available to pointing outwards. And the public involvement is critical to this success. Ocean literacy, understanding the social and cultural and economic values is a message that we have to be promoting more strongly, more often, and to a wider audience with the partners, recreational diving, world federations, maritime museums, UNESCO accredited NGOs, media, and others. These are just examples. And the outputs must be citizen science, contribution to open source big data, so that the public is fully, and stakeholders are fully engaged in assisting the professional community, heritage managers and archaeologists, to bring the information that we have at our fingertips, but place it within the context of climatic change. And I'd just like to bring to your attention the outputs from the IPCC UNESCO ICOMOS co-sponsored meetings that took place in December 2021. And these, I think, explain in great detail and many case studies the importance of intangible cultural heritage, the diverse knowledge systems and climate change, the impacts and vulnerability, and understanding the risks, and the role, importantly, the role of cultural heritage for climatic change. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Chris, for your presentation. I'd like to hand over to Dr. Arturo Rey da Silva, who will be leading our panel discussion and taking any questions from our panels, but also from our audience. So thank you very much, Arturo.
Thank you very much, Athena. Thank you very much to all the speakers that have illustrated very, very clear how important is tangible and intangible heritage and the knowledge that have passed through generations to understand better climate change, but also to adapt and project solutions. We don't have much time, as we have to finish in 15 minutes. But definitely, I mean, I welcome all the panelists and also the attendees to put the questions in the chat and start discussion with them. Just very briefly, I mean, I see that you know through all the presentations there are different type of solutions, recommendations about increasing that dialogue, seeing how somehow the knowledge from different disciplines is bringing together some data that can help us understand that climate change and adaptations. But we see very often how decisions are taken at a higher level. We see that the states and international organizations, and they're now in Sharm el-Sheikh, are talking towards creating a specific actions and solutions. And sometimes we see how that solution and that knowledge that comes from the ground, from the local communities and from the expert, doesn't really translate into decision making or doesn't have a voice that represents that. So I wanted to ask the panelists, maybe some, like for instance, you, Dr. Underwood, that you've been dealing more as well with all the organizations in United Nations, in UNESCO, and Shafman as well, Dr. Shafman, that you were talking specifically about that, the need for interdisciplinarity and creating links between society and NGOs, no, and it's one of the aims of the decade. I wanted to ask what practical solutions you see at that level, I mean, to have a voice in the table of decisions. Maybe Dr. Underwood, we can start by you. Thank you.
Thanks, Arturo. That's a very big question, isn't it? And I'm not sure I've got the big answer. However, I think what we've tried to do within ICOMOS is, in a sense, take baby steps and integrate inputs to a variety of UN-based reports. And I think I showcased Akafumi's as something that reached UN level. And it's following that. It's building on that baby step, that first input. We've got a foot in the door of a United Nations important document. We've done something similar with the Water Heritage 2023 input, a very small input, but at least you've got underwater cultural heritage mentioned in these platforms, which are really the place where things matter. The ocean, the ocean foundations, the ocean, whatever, not just the decade, but everything else linked together. And I think we've got to push hard and strong. And even if it's getting a phrase related to underwater cultural heritage, local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, the role of culture in mitigation of climate change is absolutely essential. So it becomes a bit of a top trickle-down approach. I think we're extremely good at showcasing our individual projects, which has been illuminated in this wonderful series of presentations this morning, but it's getting up the food chain. And that's why I think those co-sponsored meetings with the IPCC, ICOMOS and UNESCO were important and need to be spread, read, understood, and implemented so that you can extract bits from them and place them in these UN level reports. And it's not just about underwater cultural heritage, much more. You see that first output was all about the plurality of science which involved local knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and let's say the Western science, for want of a better term. So I'm going to hand over to Jonathan because I'm sure he's got lots to say.
Thanks. What I was going to say is just repeating what you said, which I won't do. But I think where we have a strength, or where we can really contribute, is that we understand that measuring impacts of climate is not the same as mitigating for impacts of climate change. That I agree 100% with Chris, that we can't say, well, we have the solutions to everything, because we don't. But we do have those small localized solutions that have come from a depth of knowledge that science may not be able to contribute immediately. As I said before, as heritage practitioners, archaeologists and historians and everybody else, we have access to this archive of humanity's knowledge of what to do when things go wrong. And I think those baby steps, looking at those things at that very localized level and making people aware of how that works, is the best way for us to go about integrating heritage into the decade more broadly. I think also understanding that the solutions that perhaps the scientists are looking for, those global one solution fits all, is not necessarily applicable on the local level. Very often those solutions are out of reach of people who just live along the coast. So understanding how people have adapted to that and having that archive, that tangible knowledge, well, probably intangible knowledge, but that actual archive, I think is very relevant in contributing to how people approach it and how people understand the solutions that they're trying to put forward.
Yes.
Thank you. No, you're completely right. And I mean, understanding that local knowledge, I mean, I would like to turn now to CHEP and ask more about, I mean, that experience that you and also our colleagues also from Tanzania, I mean, Dr. Ichumbaki, that experience specifically from marine science, from ecological point of view and from heritage point of view, I mean, do you see really being used at micro levels, you know, the experience and the knowledge that you've been acquiring and the solutions that you are seeing at local level, do you see them being adapted into local policy itself, or there are always difficulties to insert them into a much more national level as well? Chep, maybe you can start.
Thank you for that question. I think it can be used by policy, especially in terms of marine spatial planning, because you find, I find it, when I'm reading, I'm always seeing just one single line of cultural worship shrines, you know, like there's no articulation of exactly what it means to have a cultural dimension in this sphere. So if we can start now, the way we're saying documenting everything, they can now start saying, oh, okay, so these things are being used in this way and it can be able to influence policy. Because, for example, you might, as a scientist, you have this leaning towards what you want to do. But the people, the way they see things, it's so simplified. Like I found traditional ecological knowledge as a simplified way of looking at science, you know? So I think we just need to talk to them using the words and the terms that they understand best. Thank you.
Dr. Ichumbaki.
Thanks very much, Arturo, for the questions and for the responses. I think I will build on Chris's and Jonathan's engagements. I think the key issue here is to engage people who are capable of making noise and influencing policy. So we are aware that among ourselves, the scholars, the practitioners, we have quite a lot of information, a lot of knowledge about the things we are talking about and how to go about it. But very unfortunately, we are not able to make noise and influence policy. And even the noise that we are making about the matter doesn't go across to the people on the ground who could shout further to the policymakers and such kind of things. So it's extremely important that we look into some strategies that will make local people on the ground understand the concerns that we are raising. They understand them, but they need somebody to communicate in their language, which is much more critical. So if you look into the reports, into the publications and other materials that we have produced to inform the global community about climate change, about rising sea level and other coastal heritage matters, these are quite familiar among ourselves, but they are not quite clear to the people who can make policy. So I think it's critical that we try to simplify these kind of issues and make the case to the local people who are able to make noise and influence policy. So organizing key meetings on the ground and bringing people, let's say the members of the parliament, who can go and present this matter in the House of Commons and Parliament, would probably raise an alarm and tell people to act accordingly.
Thank you very much. We only have 5 minutes more, and I wanted to put the last questions to Professor Lane and to Dr. Holly as well, more reflecting from the academic point of view and the methods that we are using. We always talk that we work in silos sometimes in academia and that we don't introduce that traditional knowledge as well and methods from different disciplines. And we've been seeing how we are moving towards integrating different approaches from different disciplines in order to tackle this. So I would like to have a reflection on that aspect, on how academia is moving towards this type of new integration with communities and education. Professor Lane, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Arturo. And I think it relates partly also to some of the other issues that people have been raising in response to your other questions. We do not train ourselves within our disciplines, if it's archaeology or heritage related fields, on how to engage with policy, how to write policy, how to develop policy. So a fundamental thing that we need as in our own disciplines is to think about our courses and how we teach and what we teach, and to develop a new generation of practitioners who have those skills to engage with policymakers, to engage meaningfully with transforming knowledge, scientific knowledge, into actionable knowledge that can be implemented on the ground. I think also in parallel with that, we need to be, we are seeing shifts of this in archaeology, but we need, again, I think in terms of our teaching and our training, is how to best integrate indigenous knowledge into scientific knowledge. There is an unfortunate binary that scientific knowledge is often seen as having global relevance and indigenous knowledge having only local knowledge. And whilst I fully endorse an argument about think globally but act locally, and that local solutions are going to be important and indigenous knowledge has most traction at the local level, we actually also have to think about the global relevance and significance of a lot of indigenous knowledge. We need to think of it as how can that transform our own scientific knowledge systems. So those are two key areas. I would love to see a lot more cross-disciplinary training, certainly at the graduate level. There are mechanisms within Europe, what were used to be called international training networks. I think they've changed their name under the recent iteration. Those are good mechanisms, but we should be encouraging our science councils to support more of that kind of more of those kinds of programs.
Thank you very much. And finally, I mean, Dr. Georgia Holly, I mean, obviously from your experience at the university as well, and the integration of those disciplines, especially in the area of marine ecosystem and biocultural heritage, how do you see this transforming?
I agree with all of the other panelists and what we've kind of been talking about today largely, which is often a lack of discussion, as Paul was saying, between different groups. And we see that within academia itself, within academic disciplines, as you say, between marine ecologies and archaeologies. But we also see that between academia and policy, academia and industry, academia and local communities. And I think a big part of this is looking at the translation of how we speak to each other. And as Paul was talking about, that was a lot to do with education, but it's also to do with talking to different stakeholders and adapting our language as well. And we see that within talking to communities, and what we've had a lot of talks about today is, what do they want us to know? How do communities understand what cultural heritage is and what is important? Where is that? That's something that we need to learn from, and we need to adapt ourselves, rather than coming in and giving academic opinions as to what it actually means. And then as we do find this integration between disciplines and between people, which we are starting to see a lot more of today, then comes the issue of value. So what we're talking about with the different types of how we see it in policy, so how we see it in academia versus how we see it with the trickle down from, you know, large governmental or non-governmental bodies. In between that, which is what Shep mentioned, is things like marine spatial planning, integrated coastal zone management, marine protected areas, and all of these management bodies have a large influence on how marine cultural heritage is valued, is understood, is defined, and is discussed between all of these different bodies. So I think one of the most important things is engaging with these bodies and actually inserting different views into things like marine spatial planning, as Shep mentioned, that will be able to manage heritage in an interdisciplinary and mixed and integrated way.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we don't have more time for questions and comments. I hope, the messages we gave today, that in which I take, that the word transformation, adaptation, dialogue, taking the local knowledge up the stream as well. All these are very important and are needed to be taken into account. So I'm gonna give the floor back to you, Athena, to close down the meeting today. And I thank all the speakers today for all the presentations. And I hope we can continue the dialogue in many other different venues. Thank you very much. Athena, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I don't have anything more to say, but to thank our 6 speakers today and to Arturo for moderating the discussion. I hope we can continue this, and we have, for the ocean decade, another a little over 8 years to continue the dialogue. That doesn't mean it should stop there. It's a start to get us on our way to where we need to be in our practice and our policies, and as we say, our sustainable living. I think that's the key word I'll end with today. So thank you very much, and thank you all who have been with us and followed this webinar the last hour and a half. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Athena, for organizing it.
Thank you to Georgia and to Arturo.
Yeah, and Arturo and Holly.
And
bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.